Good morning. I'm Kehan Parsi, the president-elect of ASBH. I hope you're enjoying the annual conference this week and have been able to experience some of the paper sessions, live workshops, and panels, and interactive Q&A sessions with our paper and flash presenters. One great advantage to this year's virtual conference is that we as attendees are not limited by time or space. All the conference sessions will continue to be available via the conference platform through November 17th. Make sure you take advantage of all the excellent content while it's still available. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's plenary session speaker, Dr. Reshma Jagsi, who will present the ethical imperative to address gender inequity in academic medicine. Reshma Jagsi is Newman Family Professor and Deputy Chair in the Department of Radiation Oncology and Director of the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine at the University of Michigan. She graduated first in her class from Harvard College and then pursued her medical training at Harvard Medical School. She also served as a fellow in the Center for Ethics at Harvard University and completed her doctorate in social policy at Oxford University as a Marshall Scholar. As a scholar whose research has long focused on mechanisms leading to gender inequity, she will discuss studies that have investigated the drivers of women's persistent underrepresentation among the leaders of the medical profession, even in an era when half of all medical students are female. While the studies will demonstrate a myriad of complex challenges, Dr. Jagsi will also present innovative interventions that have been implemented to begin the necessary process of cultural transformation in medicine. Welcome, Dr. Jagsi.
Thank you. I want to thank you and the organizers for inviting me to present on this very important topic. We're actually recording this session during September, which is Women in Medicine Month. And I'd like to spend the next 45 to 50 minutes reviewing some research on promoting gender equity in academic medicine, which I think we can all agree is a matter of ethics. I'll begin by reviewing the nature and causes of gender inequity in academic medicine and show some research by my group and others that suggests that this is not simply due to a slow but intact pipeline and rather reflects dysfunction as a result of the impact of unconscious biases, gendered expectations of society, overt discrimination, and harassment. And then I will turn to evidence-based interventions that target those root causes. As you can see here, women's representation in the medical profession increased dramatically after Title IX in 1972 stopped institutions of higher education from discriminating against women in admissions, hiring, and promotions. I want to dwell on this slide for just a moment and have you look at the point at which we crossed over 40% of the medical student body. Because while it's true that women have not been 50% of the medical school class for very long, women have been more than 40% for over a quarter of a century. However, women remain in the small minority in positions of leadership, particularly the most influential positions of our field, those of department chair and deans, where women constitute only 18% in academic medicine. Women remain underrepresented in the prominent forms of communication and influence in our field, academic publication. So you can see here a study that I led over 15 years ago, looking at women's representation as authors, invited editorialists, and editorial board members at major medical journals. And you can see just how low a proportion were women back then. And unfortunately, this study has been replicated a number of times since, showing that we have not made as much progress as we might hope. There is, of course, an ethical imperative to act. Standing up against gender bias and harassment is a matter of professional ethics, even if professional ethical codes do not go far enough to articulate this. I think we can all agree that there are both deontological and teleological arguments that can be made to support the need to promote gender equity. The deontological arguments are really quite simple, right? So given that human beings have fundamental dignity by virtue of our capacity for rational thought and freely willed action, that dignity merits respect for its own sake, right? It's just basic Immanuel Kant. And in order to demonstrate respect for persons qua persons, there must be fair equality of opportunity for positions that are highly sought after and influential in our society, like senior positions in academic medicine. The teleological arguments are really quite interesting. They include arguments that focus on the fact that academic medicine has a tripartite mission, one of education, research, and clinical care. So, when we think about the educational mission, an example of a teleological argument would be simply to reflect on the fact that if 50% of our medical students are female, that they need senior female role models in order to encourage them to succeed in this field. In addition, there are very powerful teleological arguments that can be made with respect to the research mission. There is substantial evidence from research by Scott Page and others that has demonstrated that diverse teams outperform ones with lesser diversity. And in fact, the collective intelligence of a group is determined by the diversity of its membership. Significant insights emerge when we bring together individuals with vastly different experiences and life experiences and backgrounds, and we allow them to interact and engage. And we ask more rigorous questions, we use better methods, and we're more likely to solve the problems before us. And never before have we noted how important that is than in the age of COVID 19. Teleological arguments also extend to the clinical mission. So, that top right hand study up there, the PNAS study, is actually a study of physician patient gender concordance and mortality among patients with heart attacks. And unsurprisingly, in that study, men who present with symptoms of a heart attack do just fine, regardless of whether they're taken care of by a male or a female physician when they enter the emergency department. And they do well, equally well, as women who are taken care of by a female provider. However, women who encounter a male provider actually have significantly worse mortality outcomes as compared to the men who see men, the men who see women, and the women who see women. And we can learn from this study why this might be the case. I mean, part of the reason is that we deem chest pain that occurs in 50% of the population to be atypical chest pain. This is something that has bothered me since medical school. If 50% of if 50% of the population presents with certain symptoms, maybe a different word other than atypical chest pain might be appropriate. But in any case, there is hope also in this study, because what they showed was that male providers who were practicing in more diverse groups, in groups that had more female colleagues, actually did a better job of taking care of the female patients. And so we can learn from one another. There are benefits for all three of our missions by promoting diversity. But maybe we can just wait this out. If I don't include this this slide in a talk, I always get questions. So I will preempt the question by showing the talk and say that I don't think we can just wait this out. The best way, of course, to look at whether we can simply wait is to do a cohort study that follows cohorts longitudinally rather than the cross-sectional data that I showed you from the AAMC and from my own research of authorship. Lynn Nonamaker conducted one of these back in 2000, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing that when she looked at 15 cohorts who graduated medical school from 1979 to 1993, the proportion of women who advanced to the rank of associate professor was significantly lower than expected in all but 2 of the cohorts she studied. And even women who reached the rank of associate professor were less likely to become full professor than their male counterparts. Now, there are a number of criticisms one could make, the most obvious of which is that 1979 to 1993 is a long time ago. And it is, when I showed you that graph of women's participation in medical school, a time period when women were in the small minority. So maybe things are different now. Well, we can thank Bapu Jena and his colleagues at Mass General for looking at doximity data and replicating this, and unfortunately showing that this is indeed still an issue. Another requires further research, however, and that is the criticism that studies of the sort that bind together everyone in academic medicine may be combining apples and oranges. So women and men may go into academic medicine for different reasons and be on different career tracks or trajectories. We know, for example, from work of Julia Files and colleagues at the Mayo Clinic, that women are less likely to be represented on tenure tracks at medical schools. And it is possible, especially because we inculcate in little girls from a very young age the idea that they should exhibit communal behaviors, and communal behaviors include sort of caring for one another and might eventually lead women to want to be in academic medicine to educate the future of the field or to practice clinical care in a collaborative, scholarly, team based environment. And we inculcate in little boys agentic behaviors, going out there and doing something, for example, pursuing scholarly discovery. And so, if the men and women who are in academic medicine are pursuing academic medicine for different reasons, then there certainly might be policy implications from data like these that I've just shown you, which might be that perhaps academic medicine should value the aspects of its mission that involve clinical care and education to the same extent that academic medicine values scholarly productivity and promotions and leadership decision making. However, it's a different policy implication from that which we would draw if we actually had evidence from similarly situated, apt, and motivated men and women in whom similar degrees of success would be expected and yet did not occur. And so, this is what led me in my research to begin to study a group of individuals in whom Larry Summers himself, because when I started this, I was a student at Harvard, I was a trainee at Harvard, and Larry Summers had just made his very infamous comments at that time about why we might see gender differences. And I thought, where is there a group of individuals where Larry Summers himself would not argue the women were less apt or less able or less motivated? And I decided to study recipients of prestigious career development awards from the National Institutes of Health, specifically K08 and K23 awards made to individuals holding clinical doctorates and who have an articulated desire to pursue careers as an independent investigator. And in fact, the articulated endpoint, the goal of the K Award program, is to foster the development of independent investigators. And we all know that the most common independent investigator award made by the National Institutes of Health is the R01 grant. So, because I'm an oncologist, I decided to look at publicly available data and put some actuarial survival curves on it because this is how we analyze clinical data in my field. And in fact, it turns out to be a pretty useful way of looking at these data as well, because until this study was done, the NIH had looked, for example, at rates of success of individual applications submitted by men or women, but had not looked at the career trajectories of individuals and the success of K awardees in terms of attaining R01s. What this shows here looks like a classic treatment effect. If this were a cancer drug, I would be rushing to make that the intervention. The intervention here, however, is not going to be adding a Y chromosome. And of course, the two bars are not separated by a treatment, they are separated by gender. And what we found was that gender was an independently significant predictor of R01 attainment on a multivariable analysis where we controlled for everything we could in the publicly available data. So this is data from CRISP, which was the system that predated the reporter system that's now in place. And what we could control for was the K award type, because K08 awardees are laboratory scientists, whereas K23s are patient oriented researchers, and men are overrepresented amongst 08s and women amongst K23s. We controlled for the year of the award because women constituted higher proportions of more recent classes of K awardees. And we knew that the funding environment had gotten more difficult in more recent years. We controlled for the funding institute because women are less likely to apply to the most well-funded institutes, things like the National Cancer Institute or NHLBI, Heart, Lung, and Blood, and more likely to apply to things like mental health, aging, child health, fields that we as a society fund less well. We controlled for institution because women are overrepresented at the institutions that are in the lowest tier of overall extramural funding, suggesting that maybe they don't have as good of an environment, maybe they don't have access to grants administrators, prior successful proposals, something like that. And we controlled for specialty, and yet we found that gender remained independently significant. And not only was there a difference by gender in grant attainment, but when we looked at other outcomes, including publication productivity and leadership attainment, which we could only do through a survey questionnaire, we found differences in those as well. So we conducted a survey study which had an over 70% response rate and was supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and surveyed K awardees who received their new K awards between 2000 and 2003. And we surveyed them in 2009, and we found that not only were productivity factors different, but after we controlled for productivity and a host of other characteristics, we found that compensation differed. The large majority of the difference was driven by specialty, and that was actually our ex ante hypothesis. We thought that the gender difference in physician compensation, which has been demonstrated in other studies, would be something that we could unpick because many of the previous studies didn't even have access to information on clearly important factors like specialty. And what I thought we were going to be able to show was that the system of medical reimbursement is a bit curious and prioritizes procedures over evaluation and management services. And so specialty is very important. And so gender difference in specialization would explain a large part of the gender difference in salary. We did see that that was the case. The overall $32,000 difference, the men were being paid about $200,000, the women were being paid $168,000. That $32,000 difference was nearly cut in half simply by adjusting for specialty alone. But even when we adjusted for specialty and all of those other factors listed on the left-hand side, including those productivity measures, we could not explain away a substantial difference, $12,000 a year. So, what was going on? Well, I mentioned specialty. And choice is in quotation marks on purpose because, of course, women may be encouraged to occupy lower paid specialties, and specialties chosen by women may pay less, partly because they're predominated by women or involve those less valued feminine behaviors, those communal behaviors I mentioned earlier, right? Evaluation and management services are communal behaviors, and they are reimbursed far less well in our system of medical billing than procedures. And we see women overrepresented in specialties that do far more evaluation and management and fewer procedures. There are also differences in productivity, hours, and willingness to change institutions. But of course, we must keep in mind that we are functioning within the constraints of a gender structured society. And in our society, women tend still to marry men at or above their educational attainment and their age. And what that means is that even in two career couples in medicine, women are often just a year or two behind their partner and eventually become the trailing spouse. And so when the time comes to negotiate up one's salary by threatening to leave for another job offer elsewhere, there is a greater barrier for women to make a credible threat to leave. In fact, in our sample, over half of the men had part time or non working spouses or partners, whereas 90% of the women had full time working partners. There are also differences in rank and leadership, but it's important to keep in mind that we controlled for those. And in fact, in doing so, probably understate the unjustified gender gap in compensation. Because in fact, if we justify a gender gap by saying John gets paid more than Jane because John is the division chief and Jane is not, that assumes that the process to become division chief was itself unbiased and fair. Because if it reflected, for example, the memory of the department chair of a golf game that he played with John, and John came to mind instead of Jane, and there wasn't a posted transparent process for appointing that division chief, then paying Jane less is actually a double whammy. She doesn't get to be the division chief and she doesn't get paid like a division chief. In any case, a substantial unexplained gender difference remains even after we account for all of these factors and more. So, what else could be going on? Well, maybe mothers are sacrificing pay for unobserved job characteristics like flexibility, and fathers are trying to earn more to support their families, right? This is gender concordant potential behavior. And other studies have suggested that this is part of the explanation, but it is by no means the explanation for the findings in this study. Because in this study, there was a relatively homogeneous job type of physician researchers and no interaction observed between gender and parental status. Even women without children had lower pay than men. It's also possible that gender differences in values or behavior of the employees plays out in terms of negotiations. So I'm sure many of you are aware and have read the wonderful book by Babcock and Lashover titled Women Don't Ask. If you have not, I would commend to you the sequel, Ask for It, which can be read by both men and women to learn that principled negotiation is, in fact, not, as most physicians actually think it is, icky like buying a used car. It is not hard positional bargaining. It involves relationships and connections and the identification of mutual interests and the potential for shared gains. And it is something that is very, very important because it's not just compensation that differs by gender, it is access to resources. So there was a wonderful study published in JAMA that showed that startup funds allocated to women rather than men were lower. And if we don't give women the resources they need to succeed as leaders in academic fields, then we as the leaders also don't reap the rewards of seeing them succeed. So we do have shared interests here. There are differences in employer behavior, including the phenomenon of statistical discrimination, which is where employers make inferences based on group rather than individual characteristics, and the concept of the family wage, the idea that we pay a single male breadwinner what is needed to support the family at home, and we take into account extra professional needs for pay rather than professional contributions when setting pay. We also all have deeply ingrained unconscious biases, men and women alike. And a National Academy of Sciences report details the impressive body of controlled experimental studies and examination of decision making processes in real life that show that, on the average, people are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications, less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments, and when information is scarce, far more often give the benefit of the doubt to a man than a woman. And the classic study of this sort was led by Stein Price and colleagues with their colleagues in academic psychology. And they sent around sham CVs. Each individual received only one CV, and they were told, we'd like to know, we're academic psychologists like you, we'd like to know what your institution prioritizes in terms of hiring and evaluation processes. And so could you rate this CV for us? And half the people got a CV that was titled Karen Miller, and half the people got the same CV, exact same CV, with the title Brian Miller. And they asked him, would you hire this person? And could you just give us some objective ratings of the individuals teaching, their scholarship, and their service? And it turns out that not only is Karen Miller less likely to be hired than Brian Miller, but she gets objectively lower ratings of merit on the basis of the exact same CV. And the only difference is that her name is Karen, not Brian. And this has been shown in the setting of medicine in this PNAS study looking at laboratory manager hiring. And the really disappointing news is the study in the bottom right, which actually shows that if your name is Lakeisha or Jamal, you have to have 9 extra years of experience to get called for interviews at the same rate as Emily and Greg. So this calls attention to the fact that we all have multiple identities. And up until now, I've been speaking about gender as if it were binary and monolithic. There are just women and men. But of course, we know that gender is not binary and that we all inhabit a number of identities beyond being male or female. We also have a gender identity that may include a number of other categories. We have race, we have ethnicity, we have age, we have social class. And the intersection of all of these identities defines our unique lived experiences. And so the concept of intersectionality, initially proposed by Kimberly Crenshaw in the legal literature, involves the idea that we cannot simply summate the experiences of being in one group to being in another group to understand the true barriers and challenges and lived experiences of an individual with multiple intersecting minority identities. There have been not only the National Academy's report that I mentioned earlier, from which I read you the quote, but also one that came out just earlier this year on promising practices for addressing underrepresentation of women in science, engineering, and medicine. And one of the key takeaways from those reports is the ongoing need for more research in the area of individuals with intersecting multiple minority identities. We don't play on a level playing field, and gender neutral norms, practices, and policies can have a disparate negative impact upon women. These include policies regarding leave from medical training. When a member board of the American Board of Medical Specialties says that a trainee can have at most 4 weeks of leave for any reason during a year, that policy is going to have disparate negative impact on the one sex that bears children and lactates, not to mention the one gender that bears the greater burden of domestic responsibility in our society. There are expectations regarding work hours, especially in academic medicine, that are quite curious. We try to include everyone. And in so doing, we don't want to interfere with anyone's clinic day or anyone's OR schedule. And so frequently, I am asked to deliver in totally non ironic form by really well intended leaders 7 a.m. or 6 p.m. lectures on work life integration that will therefore be able to include everyone. And unfortunately, the people that are actually systematically excluded by having important meetings very early in the morning or very late in the evening are, in fact, those who have substantial extra professional caregiving responsibilities, which in our society is more likely to be the women. There are also policies like tenure clocks and limits on grant eligibility that further amplify the collision of biological and professional clocks and this inequity of the traditional gender division of labor. The next study is actually my favorite study, I think, ever that we've conducted. It is a study of R01 attainment funded by an R01. So my first R01 was the most meta R01 I think NIH has ever given to anyone. It's an R01 on what determines R01 attainment. Remember those independent grants. And we looked at time allocation the way that labor economists do, looking at paid and unpaid labor. And we specifically looked at time spent on parenting and domestic tasks. And that is that last bar there where women are spending 44 hours and the married or partnered men are spending 32 hours. And so you can see that among married or partnered respondents with children, even after we adjust for other factors, including spousal employment status, because you'll remember I just told you that they have very, very different spousal employment status, the women were spending 8.5 hours more per week on parenting and domestic tasks. And this is a study conducted well before COVID. We also asked a question that I've always said was my favorite question and is even more my favorite question now that we're experiencing the disruptions of COVID, which was we asked, what do you do when your childcare is disrupted? And we specifically said, when there's a snow day at school or your nanny can't come in because your nanny's sick or your kid can't go to daycare because your kid is sick. We did not say because schools are closed for 3 months and social distancing won't permit you to have anyone else in your home. But you can extrapolate from these data that 43% of the women in this high achieving K awardee population, so these were K awardees who got their new awards between 2006 and 2009. They were Generation Xers. They grew up with an egalitarian expectation for the division of domestic labor, and 43% of the women said, I deal with it myself. The options were, I deal with it myself, my spouse or partner deals with it, or we have someone else. So you can see that only 12% of the men indicated that. And this is important because it actually helps to explain a phenomenon that has been shown in many studies, which is a consistent gender difference in work-related burnout amongst physicians. And depending on how you measure this, whether you use Copenhagen or Maslow, whether you cut things off as a binary endpoint, where you set the cutoff point, the numbers differ a little bit, but pretty consistently across studies, you will find that 40% of female physicians and 30% of male physicians are burned out. And the reason for that gender difference has been the subject of considerable speculation. What was really nice about our R01 grant was that we actually had longitudinal data that allowed us to look at what might be the drivers of burnout with that longitudinal design. And what we found were two things: the time pressures that I just mentioned and perceptions of work climate. So why might women perceive the work climate to be worse than men? The idea that sexual harassment is like an iceberg was first proposed by my colleague Lilia Cortina here at the University of Michigan. She does this because much attention focuses on the tip of the iceberg, the very visible, overt, egregious acts of sexual assault and coercion that we all find appalling. But what lies beneath the surface and often goes unnoticed but has a substantial negative impact on the endpoints that we care about: physical well-being, mental well-being, and professional well-being, turnover intentions and attrition from the field. The things underneath the surface actually have been shown by occupational psychologists, organizational psychologists for decades to be associated with those endpoints of well-being. And so, sexist remarks and behaviors, those put downs underneath the surface, are very important. And they determine the perception of climate that can then lead to burnout. In academic medicine, we led this study in that same survey that I mentioned of Generation XK awardees. We asked a single item about whether they had encountered unwanted sexual comments, attention, or advances by a superior or colleague. We asked it that way partially because we wanted a good survey response rate, and this survey had an over 70% response rate, so we felt it was generalizable. We also asked it that way because we wanted to be able to compare to a study that was conducted in 1995. And in that study, which was a cross sectional survey of academic medical faculty in 95, many of whom went to medical school in the 70s and the 80s when women were in the small minority of medical student bodies. They found that 52% of the women had experienced sexual harassment defined this way. Now, of course, had we defined it using the SEQ, the Sexual Experiences Questionnaire, the gold standard in the literature of organizational psychology for measuring these experiences, which doesn't just ask one monolithic question, but actually asks 20 different behaviors that people may have experienced, these rates would have been much higher. And of course, if we had asked about experiences of harassment by patients rather than only by coworkers, these rates would have been higher. It's also critically important to note that many perceived a negative effect on confidence in themselves as professionals, and nearly half reported that these experiences negatively affected their career advancement. So this was not without consequence. So this paper, you can see the date up there, was published in May of 2016. So this is before the last presidential election. It is before the increase in attention to the Me Too movement in Hollywood. And after this paper came out, I received an outpouring of emails. And I'm just going to share one of them with you because I think there is such power to the detailed, nuanced narratives that individual women can share. And I do this with her permission. In a program where the chair invites the male but not female residents and attendings over for poker, these things largely go unnoticed. I've wondered if something was pathologically wrong with me that I invited that kind of behavior. Was it because I wasn't smart enough? Was it because I was soft spoken? Was it because there was something so wrong with me that I couldn't even recognize it? I read your article with a mixture of simultaneous dismay and relief. Relief because if they've gone through similar things, then maybe I'm not defective. I don't think I can ever talk about my experiences, partially because of fear, partially because it seems ungrateful to do so. There's so much here in this piece, and I think that she speaks to the power of the Me Too movement that followed, about the sharing of experiences and realizing that it's no individual woman's doing, and that this is the fault of a culture that is deeply flawed within academic medicine and that requires being addressed. Fortunately, there are evidence-based interventions that we can pursue in order to address these strikingly high rates of harassment in medicine. And I will point out that in the National Academy's report that came out in 2018, female medical students were 220% more likely than students in non-STEM disciplines to experience sexual harassment. And so we must gather data to improve our understanding, especially for those individuals with those intersecting multiple minority identities, in order to inform interventions and to demonstrate the commitment of organizations. Because it turns out that in meta-analyses of tens of thousands of employees of organizations, the single strongest predictor of harassment in an organization is the perception of the employees that the organization itself tolerates harassment. We must facilitate reporting and offer choices in terms of complaint handlers and reporting processes, anonymous and confidential processes, complaint handlers who are senior and junior and diverse in every way. We must clarify those policies because the lowest rates of sexual harassment occur in organizations that proactively develop, disseminate, and enforce policy. And we must address harassment by patients and families. Our own institution, the University of Michigan, has recently redesigned our patient rights and responsibilities statement, and I believe that this is an exemplar for other institutions. Rather than shrugging our shoulders and saying what patients bring to us is beyond our control, it's a broader societal issue, we have the opportunity to recognize, as everyone in this audience recognizes, the tremendous power and privilege of the medical profession, and use that to set standards and expectations for behavior that may then extend beyond clinical encounters. We actually may be able to be the agents of societal change. Ultimately, the causal pathways here are bidirectional. So, not only does sexual harassment contribute to gender inequity, but gender inequity is an environment within which sexual harassment thrives. And so, in order to combat sexual harassment, we have to think about why the iceberg forms in the first place. And you can see here in the water those factors that I've been discussing throughout this lecture. And we must target those and create structures that employ more women, promote more women, and integrate more women into every level of the organization so that we end up with a well integrated, structurally egalitarian workplace in which women and men equally share in power and authority. We can do this by developing mentoring programs that provide opportunities that might otherwise be allocated by an informal old boys network. We can help women and minorities learn to play games they didn't learn in childhood. We may teach negotiation skills or provide individuals who may negotiate on certain people's behalf. We can facilitate the formation of these into networks rather than hierarchical dyads, which is not only safer, but also more effective. And we can encourage a focus on sponsorship because there is plenty of literature that suggests that women will get plenty of mentorship, just not the sponsorship that is so critical to becoming visible and ultimately becoming a leader. We cannot focus on fixing the women. We must fix the systems through institutional change, including evidence-based implicit bias training, cultural transformation initiatives, transparent and consistent criterion-based evaluation, promotion, and compensation processes. If we do not have creative interventions like term limits on chair positions in academic medicine, that we looked and the longest serving chair in academic medicine had been there for 43 years. And while I understand that it takes some time to get one's feet under you and that one might not be maximally effective in the first year or two, when I ask longstanding chairs who initially seem opposed to term limits when they hit their stride, few say that it took them more than 5 years. And few believe that after 15 or 20 years, that there is a benefit to their experience that outweighs the benefits of diversity that would come from turning over those positions. And unfortunately, if we don't change the slope of this graph, the current class of medical students who are 50% female will have retired before we reach parity at the most senior levels of our field. We need to promote work-life integration now more than ever, as is becoming increasingly visible and evident in our post-COVID world. There are really creative solutions like Distinguished Scholar Awards that provide funding to support individuals who have substantial extra professional caregiving needs, including a national program by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. When we return to being able to convene in person, we need to facilitate on-site childcare and the use of funds to support travel-related dependent care expenses. And we need to look to innovators like Stanford University that came up with a really clever time banking pilot project where individuals who provided service that's not typically recognized or rewarded and that often disproportionately falls to women and minorities were recognized for this, given points that they could then redeem for other services they needed, be it grant writing support in the workplace or food delivery service at home. I show this slide to provide hope to the younger people in the audience. The first perspective there was something that I wrote when I was pregnant with my first child, and the American Board of Radiology came out with really strict 4-week-a-year limits on leave from residency training. That was in 2007 that was published, and we actually were not allowed to include some of the recommendations that were included in the second perspective listed there, the one that we published in 2019, including establishing a minimum of 6 weeks of paid leave for all GME trainees with an intent to move towards 12 weeks. When we as a profession advocate through the American Academy of Pediatrics for 12 weeks of paid parental leave for all human beings in society, it seems curious that we do not provide this for the trainees in our own field. And I am proud to say that the American Board of Medical Specialties, the overseeing organization that oversees all of the boards that credential our trainees to become independent practitioners within various specialties, has now come out just this summer with a new policy supporting 6 weeks of paid leave. We can leverage social media. The time is perfect right now to accelerate the trajectory of change. Her Time Is Now is an active social media campaign as I'm recording this lecture. And I would encourage you to follow me on Twitter at Reshma Jagsi and others who are trying to build a community that shares the literature in this area and also to help individuals feel less isolated. I think there's a wonderful benefit to the community building aspects of social media where individuals might have felt like the only where they were, but do not anymore, thanks to the salutary impact of social media. The Physician Moms Group is over 70,000 members strong, and I think it's a real testament to the power of this particular innovation. COVID-19 is amplifying the challenges that I've discussed here. Earlier this year, and this is not by any means a definitive study, but it was something that we did with the data that we had available at the time, there were anecdotes emerging that women were having greater difficulty with submitting publications to journals in the early months of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I thought, well, where could we get early data on this? Well, COVID-19 papers on the subject of COVID-19, pretty much by definition, probably were written at least largely after the disruptions, both the disruptions of extra professional caregiving experiences and the disruptions within the workplace, whereby we almost overnight transitioned from in-person clinical care and teaching to virtual care delivery and virtual education, burdens that I suspect were borne by the clinician educators in our system primarily, and we know that that's where women are overrepresented. And so we thought there might be more of an impact on women. And sure enough, when we compared authorship of COVID-19 papers to papers published in 2019 in those same journals, there does appear to be a decrease in female first authorships. And so, of course, this will require more research to substantiate, but it is worrisome that, if anything, things might be getting worse. We inhabit a momentous time in history right now. We're very fortunate to have the opportunity to move from the awareness of the Me Too movement to the action orientation of Time's Up. And I'm very proud to be a founding member of Time's Up Healthcare, which encourages the application of a very familiar healthcare quality improvement framework with which most of us are very well familiar. And we look at structures and processes and outcomes, and we go through an iterative cycle of plan, do, study, act to improve those outcomes. In summary, ensuring equity is a matter of professional ethics. Men and women do not share equally in power and authority in our field. The cause is not simply a slow pipeline. Even similarly situated men and women are not rewarded similarly, even today. Evidence-based interventions must target the root causes of gender inequity. We need more attention to tailor interventions for women from other underrepresented groups. And we must share insights across fields about how best to transform culture and climate. And to that end, I hope that you'll attend the panel discussion on Sunday on Me Too and gender equity in bioethics specifically, a field in which we can clearly appreciate the ethical arguments for this, and yet relatively little empirical investigation or intervention has been taken to date. Thank you very much for your attention. I want to acknowledge my many collaborators, not all of whom are listed here. I have so many wonderful collaborators and the funders of the research that I had the opportunity to share with you. Thank you very much.